Okay, so this is a video for April 21st, 2020. One key concept today, Columbian exchange, called the Columbian exchange after Christopher Columbus, after he sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So I did put a little meme there. They call me Mr. Sail Your Land, because of course he's credited with discovering America and then essentially taking it away or taking it over from the Native Americans that were already living here. So I just thought it'd be funny to kind of put it there. The essential question is, what were the causes of the Columbian exchange and its effects on the Eastern and Western hemisphere? So the Eastern hemisphere is going to be pretty much the Old World or Europe. E for Eastern, E for Europe, if that helps you remember it. Western hemisphere is going to be the New World, so America, and it's going to be the exchange that's happening between these two different, essentially they're called worlds at the time because of the separation, because of the isolation, nobody really knew that either side had existed on either parts of the world. And so because of centuries of disconnect, you're going to see this new blending, mixing, interacting between these two groups, and it's going to cause long-lasting effects that are going to change the lives pretty much forever of all these people and us as well. So the first thing is it's important to know that there was an exchange of goods, so materials, crops and things like that, but also diseases, other types of foods, animals that occurred during this exchange as well. So the first thing that people really pay attention to is the diseases. When the Europeans came, they wiped out anywhere between 50 to 90% of the indigenous population. Indigenous just means native, or the Indians. A little bit of backstory. Remember, Columbus called them Indians because he thought he had landed in India. He was trying to find a faster route to Asia, and so that's why he called them Indians. But he really had no idea where he was. He actually kind of stumbled upon this place. So just a little bit of backstory. That's why they're called Indians, or their Native Americans were called Indians. Anyways. So they had no immunities to European diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, malaria. And over the centuries, Europeans had developed immunities to these diseases. Immunities is like the way that your body fights off disease or viruses or bacteria or illness and stuff like that. And over time, your body builds up these natural defenses. The Indians or the Native Americans didn't have any time to prepare. So when the Europeans came and they brought these diseases over with them, it was like an extreme shock to the system. And anywhere between 50 to 90% of the population perished and died, and some entire tribes were wiped out. It was very, very devastating. The picture at the top is showing Indians who are suffering from smallpox. Smallpox was probably one of the deadliest ones. Today we do have a vaccine for it. We also have a vaccine for measles. You get them usually when you're really, really, really little. Influenza is like the flu. And malaria, there's no cure for it, but there is a way to treat it today. So there are modern day medicine advances that have made it easier to fight these really deadly diseases. Most people just focus on the fact that Europeans brought diseases over here, but Native Americans also had diseases here that we gave to the Europeans as well. But that really isn't very mentioned, or is not mentioned a whole lot in history, but it is important to know that the exchange did go both ways. The other thing is the animals and food. So Native Americans originally actually ate very little meat. There weren't very large kind of like pack animals or cattle or anything like that. Most of the animals they used for other resources, and they didn't actually kill them for food. Yes, they did. They did hunt and things like that, but it wasn't an essential or a staple part of their diet. But when you have the introduction of things like pigs and cows, it would change the American diet because they would become like almost like an everyday, not necessity, but they would become an everyday staple in their food group, if you will. So bacon burgers, yum. No, I'm just kidding. Then you also have the horse, which was brought to America, which is ironic because originally the horse was from the Americas in the first place. When I mentioned way back then, when the Bering Strait was frozen over and it was that big giant ice bridge, the horse made its way to the Eastern Hemisphere, and then it stayed over there, and then the horses that were here kind of died out. So it's weird that they were from here, went over there, and then they came back. So now they brought the horse back. Most people, when they picture Indian, the stereotypical image of an Indian is an Indian on a horse, but most Native Americans didn't have access to horses because they weren't here in the first place. It wasn't until the Europeans came that they gave them access to horses through trade, through borrowing, through bartering, through other things and other processes. And so it wasn't until after Columbus came that Native Americans began using the horse, which was also important because now the natives could hunt over larger areas of territory and over larger areas of land, so it allowed them to go farther, which does allow them a surplus or an excess of food. It would also end up causing hostile interactions between tribes because now that tribes can go farther because of travel, they are going to fight over territory and they're going to fight over land, and they're also going to kind of fight over competition of who is the better horse people or horsemen, if you will. And then sometimes this food surplus would allow these Native Americans to spend more time focusing on art and spirituality as well. So the Columbian exchange is pretty much shown there, if you will. Things that went from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Things like squash, pumpkins, turkeys, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn. Also things like sweet potatoes, peppers, tobacco, pineapples, the cocoa bean, regular beans, and vanilla. Things that came from Europe to the Americas. We'll start first with the foods. So onions, olives, turnips, coffee beans, peaches, pears, grains, wheat, rice, barley, oats, livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, and then of course all the nasty ones, diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. So some really ugly things as well. Okay, cash crops. Sugar is going to become a huge, huge, huge cash crop in the New World. So Spain is going to spend a lot of their time focused on silver, but Portugal would focus on sugar, and that's going to be important. Sugar is actually what's going to kickstart triangular trade and eventually the Atlantic slave trade movement, which is the forced migration of slaves into the New World. Sugar cultivation in Brazil required the constant importation of slaves. It was extremely, extremely necessary for them to have a lot of people on hand to work on these plantations, and so these people were taken from their homes, mostly from the West African coast, by force, so they did not obviously come willingly, and they came to work on the plantations mostly in Brazil, which is a part or a territory that Portugal controlled. Sugar is actually going to eclipse silver as the main money-making thing for Europe, and then eventually tobacco will soon follow later. But it's crazy because sugar will actually become more valuable and more important than silver. And you would think silver would be more important because it's, silver and it's like money, essentially. And Spain spent a lot of their time focused on the silver mines in the Americas, but sugar would be the one to take it over. The Treaty of Tordesillas is going to become important because it's an agreement between Spain and Portugal. Since these were the first two European countries that came and discovered the New World, Spain was first with the voyages of Christopher Columbus, but Portugal would also venture out and send their explorers as well. England was busy fighting with each other, so they wouldn't show up later until the 1600s, so this is happening in the 1500s. Spain and Portugal are obviously going to fight over territory. So the Treaty of Tordesillas is basically a divisional line that kind of cuts North and South America in half, and it gives some territory to Spain and it gives some territory to Portugal, and that was the whole purpose of this treaty. The treaty, as you can obviously see, the yellow line is what's known as the papal division, papal referring to the Pope. So it goes down and it really only gives them control of a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of South America, which is kind of like where Brazil is. The reason for that is because the Pope at the time was that guy, Alexander VI. His original name is Rodrigo Borgia, and he happens to be of Spanish descent. So obviously, looking in terms of division for Spain and Portugal, which side is he going to favor? He's going to favor Spain. So he gives the larger amount of territory to Spain, obviously. Later, the treaty is going to be redesigned, and Portugal is going to get a little bit more territory, and the treaty lines will be kind of rearranged, but even then, Portugal still gets a very, very small portion. The thing that backfired for the Spanish is that the Spanish spent so much of their time and their energy focusing, again, on silver, and silver is eventually going to lead, or it's going to cause inflation in the economy, and it's going to go down, while sugar becomes a resource that people want all over the world, and it's going to cause massive amounts of, what do you call it, like supply and demand. And so Portugal is actually going to be the one that comes out on top. So it actually backfired on that guy, but he wouldn't be around to see it. Okay. Forced labor. So the forced movement of African people is known as the African diaspora. Diaspora refers to any community that is forced to move or migrate or relocate, or they're kicked out of their homes either willingly or unwillingly. Basically, in this version, it is slavery. They are taken forcibly from their homes. You have an estimated somewhere maybe 10 million people were taken from just the West African coast alone. It is insane, the amount of people that were stolen from their homeland. The thing also that affected the people from this area and from this territory was language. So the language, or the African language, a lot of it was lost, and it was not able to be translated or transplanted to the New World. The reason for this is because I did mention the West African coast, because that is where the majority of the slaves were taken from, but they were also taken from the East African coast. They were taken from the Congo, which is in the middle of Africa as well. And so these people were put on these slave ships. They were all blended together. They were all mixed together, and people couldn't communicate with each other. And so essentially their language does get lost. Sometimes African languages could be combined with the colonizer language, so Spanish or French. For example, Creole. You're going to see that in the southern states or the southern United States areas. But most of it was lost, which is extremely sad. Music is actually going to come to the New World. It should be New World, and was used as a means of survival under very harsh conditions. It was meant to keep the spirits up, and it also helped the enslaved African people communicate with each other. So sometimes there were a lot of hidden messages in these songs. So like one of them, and there's different versions of this song, not different versions, but different interpretations. So the song Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Some people say the Sweet Chariot is a reference to death, coming to take people home, like to heaven, like they should be looking forward to the afterlife, like once this life is over here, they have something to look forward to then. Some people think that the Sweet Chariot is actually a reference to the Underground Railroad. So there's different versions of what this song could potentially mean, but they would sing it to kind of keep their spirits up and keep the hope alive between them. Food is also going to be really important to the African people. It's actually going to be a major influencer in North American cuisine as well. So this is a picture of roughly estimated slave trade. And if you notice, about 5 million slaves were sent to Brazil alone, and that is because of the sugar plantation. So I mentioned there was a very, very, very high demand for slaves in this area because they needed constant workers or constant people to run these things. Eventually they would get the nicknames maquilas because they would run like machines, and that's how they needed to run in order to be able to meet the needs of supply and demand for the rest of the places. So on the map you can see in Peru 0.5 million, Central America 0.2 million, in the US Eastern Coast 0.5 million, some other slaves that went to Europe that were domestic workers 0.3 million, in the West Indies, which is kind of like the Caribbean or the Caribbean depending on how you pronounce it, 4.5 million, again also for sugar plantations, tobacco plantations. A lot of it had to do with the cash crops, so you're going to see the majority of these people being sent to this area for that reason. This last two slides, I'm not going to kind of explain it in super detail because I've already explained it. I just want you guys to have the information and to have the access available to you. So if you have the slides on Google Classroom, you're able to see them. Whoops, I skipped myself. Whoops, I went back. Whoops, what am I doing? Sorry. So yes, so this first slide tells you at the very, very top what went from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere, and then the other slide is going to tell you what went the other way, from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere. And very lastly, your exit ticket. I just want you guys to catch up on your work. Catch up on your work, relax, rest up, turn in anything you're missing for me, for any of your other teachers. Spend time doing something that you enjoy, and I want you guys to continue to be safe. So that's pretty much it. I don't want to give you guys an assignment for today. Just we'll just do all those things. So make sure you catch up on your work and rest up. So miss you guys. See you later. Bye. Sorry for me rambling, but yeah, that's me. I'm just weird. Okay, bye.